Hello guys, it's me, Guidier. Today I want to talk about something that I am calling the support paradox. Because in the game's current state, I don't believe that support heroes are actually support heroes anymore. And that is primarily because they're forced into being DPS heroes by the nature of 5v5 and matchmaking quality. So, let me give you an example of a scenario, right? Let's say, it actually doesn't even matter what the characters are, right? But there's a DPS hero and a support hero, right? The DPS hero is trying to close the distance on a support hero. So the DPS, whatever it may be, uses their engagement tool. Think Genji Dash, think Reaper TP, think any of these abilities, right? That are good at closing the distance on a support character. That support character then is forced into a position where they have to use their get away from me tool. So think like Ana Nade, Ana Sleep, Carry TP, Carry Suzu, Babs Exo Jump, right? There's a lot of them, right? And what happens is that DPS is then put in a position where they have minimal impact until they can attempt to use their engage tool again to get onto someone to close the distance onto them again. However, that support hero is still just as effective as they were before, if not more effective for a few seconds, because they know that the engagement tool that was used cannot be used again for a certain period of time, allowing them to do more risky plays and take riskier angles, meaning that when DPS actually try to do their job and try to kill them and try to close the distance on them and try to take a fight with them, it actually ends up benefiting the support more than if the DPS had just played more passively in a lot of scenarios. Not obviously everyone. It obviously comes down to how well the support is able to execute their get off me tool, right? Like if you're Ana and you throw your nade in your sleep and you miss both of them, well then it's irrelevant, you know, because they're just going to kill you. But if you sleep them or you nade them, you force them into a position where they are required to run away from you. Therefore, that support then gets to stand at the back of the map. They keep dealing damage, they keep outputting tons of healing, they keep dedicating resources to their team, they keep winning space, and so on, while the DPS do nothing. And this is by design. The game is made to be this way. That's why everyone says the support heroes are just DPS 2. It's just DPS 2. It's the same reason why people say the tank heroes are just DPS 2. Again, it's just the second version of them. Because what happened is, there are a couple of things. It's two reasons. Initially, the move to 5v5 is one of them, and the next reason is match quality / Q times. For example, let's talk about the Q times and the match quality first. If you are, let's say, an old Ana player and you have less DPS potential, less killing potential. Now, Ana always had a lot, but she's got a lot more now than she did before. So let's say you're that Ana, there might be a scenario where you might play absolutely perfectly as a support, but end up having lesser impact than the roles that are better at killing people, because maybe the enemy team's DPS were much better than your team's DPS, and therefore it meant that your team was dying a lot more often, even if you were playing really well, because of the fact that you simply were not able to kill things as effectively as those DPS were. So what they did was, in the move to 5v5, they had to make it so that the supports were drastically better at fighting things than they were before, for two reasons. Firstly, match quality, and secondly, the lack of an off-tank. I've talked about this a million times before, but for anyone new, basically, the supports were forced into being more DPS duelist-style characters by nature of the fact there was no off-tank anymore to help peel for them. Therefore, they had to apply their own peel for themselves by winning those duels, therefore meaning that they had to be more offensive, they had to have more ability to actually kill things, so that they didn't need that off-tank in order to save them when things happened to them, right? That's an important distinction to make between some of the other reasons that some support changes were made. But primarily speaking, the nature of them becoming DPS was primarily because of the change to 5v5, but it was also beneficial due to the match quality, meaning that when you do swap it over to being so that the supports are more DPS focused, more DPS oriented, it means that they also have more impact on the game because they can actually kill things, right? And you would think that's a good thing. And on paper, it is. But the issue was that the supports were given that ability to duel things, while the DPS's ability to duel things did not improve to try to offset the fact that the supports were good at dueling now. So now you have DPS that are at the same level of duel potential as they were before, if not even less than, because they don't have off-tank resources to help engage for them anymore, and they're now fighting into supports that have all of the survivability and utility as they did before, with buff dueling potential, meaning that it's drastically harder for a DPS to kill a support. And that is, again, like I said, primarily a cause of 5v5 and so on. But onto the support paradox, like I explained in the start, where because they have been made this way, it means that as a support hero, you are less of a support hero than a DPS is in a lot of cases. When it comes to the actual definition of what supporting generally is, the DPS heroes in this game tend to have a larger amount of actual support output than the supports do, because the supports are generally speaking going to be taking more duels. They're going to be forced into taking those duels, meaning that they are going to need to be outputting more damage in order to get themselves out of those duels, and to compensate for the fact that their own DPS on their team are getting forced out of space and angles and so on by the enemy team's supports, meaning that as a support, you then need to fill that role of that DPS, or of your own team's DPS, getting forced out of their angles by the enemy team's support. Meaning that as a support character, you are closer to a DPS than a DPS is, technically speaking, right? Because think of what a DPS does today, generally speaking. Now, this doesn't apply to everyone. It doesn't apply to Widowmaker in the same way it would apply to something like a Genji. It wouldn't apply to an Ashe in the same way that it would to like a Mei. Obviously, it's going to have different levels of support output, technically speaking, than other characters, right? It's going to differentiate between the heroes. But when you look at the majority of the flex DPS cast, because it doesn't really affect the hit scans that much, when you look at the majority of the flex DPS cast, they're almost entirely, their purpose is creating space. They have taken the off-tank role. They're not really much of a go-in, flank, duel. Now, obviously, they still do all those things. They still do those things. That's important to remember. But when you think of like old age supports, providing your team utility, providing your team opportunities, creating opportunities through your cooldown usage, making it so that you're, you're helping someone in a duel, like you're following someone around, you're providing resources to them, right? Now, obviously, the supports do that better than the DPS do, even in this explanation, right? But when you think relative to each other, the DPS relatively are obviously better at DPSing than supports are. However, when you look at how good supports are at DPSing and compare them together, it means that the DPS are closer to supports in terms of like what they do than supports are closer to supports, because of the fact that the supports have so much DPS potential now, if you understand what I'm saying. Like, obviously, DPS still DPS, supports still support. They're still better at those things individually. However, supports are closer to being amazing DPSs, right? As opposed to they are being amazing supports, because they need the extra dueling potential and they haven't been given extra support resources, as opposed to the fact they've been given extra DPS resources and the DPS have been given nothing. Therefore, the supports are better DPSs than the DPSs are in a lot of cases, apart from the application of the DPS passive, meaning that the supports are DPSs and the DPS are actually supports in a lot of cases, because supporting isn't just heal output and so on. Like I said before, it's the the dedication of where resources are planted. It's helping certain people to create opportunities, to create space. It's helping individuals to create like resource imbalances on the enemy team and so on. And the DPSs tend to do that a lot more now than the supports do now, because the supports are taking more duels, as opposed to how it was in Overwatch 1, where the DPS were obviously more DPS dealt. They were more killing focused. They were more go out and take a fight focus, while the supports obviously took the old age support focus of applying resources to your team and so on. Does this make sense? This is what I mean by the support paradox, and maybe I didn't explain it super well, but generally speaking, to summarize what I mean, is as the move to 5v5 in Overwatch 2 took place, the supports were massively buffed in their DPS potential so that they were able to survive without the help of an off-tank, because it didn't exist anymore. Meaning that they got a massive boom in their DPS potential. However, because of all the other support designs in the game, the tank designs, it meant that the DPS were doing less, because you couldn't close the distance on things as easily. You didn't have as much individual survivability because there wasn't enough tank to provide that individual survivability to you and so on. But the supports didn't need that. Therefore, they took a pseudo DPS role where they were able to duel and fight as they were while also supporting, meaning that the supports became really amazing at DPSing. However, the DPSs themselves didn't get better at dueling, and also didn't take the place of other things. Therefore, they had to become essentially pseudo off-tanks, and the supports took the DPS role, and the DPS role have taken a pseudo off-tank role / support role as well, with the allocation of resources. That's what I mean. That's the support paradox. And that is, if you are a support hero, you are more likely to actually be a DPS hero than you are a support hero. And if you are a DPS hero, you are more likely to be a support hero than a DPS hero. If that makes sense at the higher level of play, generally speaking. Like, if you're gold, it's obviously not going to play out that way. But in the higher level of play, generally speaking, that is how it goes. Which is not good for the game. Anyway, I love you all. I hope you have a good day. Hopefully that made sense. Ramblings of an institutionalized man. Have a good day. I appreciate the people around you. Goodbye. Love you. Goodbye. 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 Goodbye.